This is Songwriting, and I'm Matt Carano, and I'm filming this on location, so things feel a little bit kludgy. I've got a lot of stuff in a little bit of space, but I'll try to muddle through. But anyway, in these songwriting videos, I am either talking about my songs and things I figured out while writing, problems I've solved, or I also talk about brilliant songwriting from other artists that I love. And so this video is going to be about Climbing Up the Walls by Radiohead. And so Radiohead's my favorite band. This is my favorite album all time, I think, still. And it's really dense. And it's like you can see the shift in Radiohead after this. Like you listen to the bends before this, it's a really dense album. There's a lot of instrumentation, a lot of orchestration. Things are mixed, really dense as well, with like a lot of verb and a lot of delays. And OK Computer is like takes it to kind of the limit of where you can go in terms of how much you can fit into a song and into an album. And then after this, when they go into Kid A, it's a lot more sparse, and they tend to be more sparse sort of throughout their career. Even in my second favorite album, which is 10 years later, in Rainbows, it's more akin to OK Computer, but still much more sparse albums. But anyway, it's hard to write dense music and have it sound good. I know, like, as I've been writing this year, I've really tried to limit the amount of instruments I use and the effects I use. I try to cut things down because I've sort of found that if you've got something in the song, you want to make sure people can hear it. We want to make sure that people can identify what it is. It needs to have a purpose. It needs to be heard. Now, sometimes you can break that rule, like if you're laying down some pads, some keys, or some strings, just to like create some sort of this, or create a bit of a harmonic structure. That's okay. But in general, I think the rule is try to slim down as much as possible, because then people can enjoy all the instruments that you put in there. And I think the tendency is to overwrite. But I wouldn't change anything about OK Computer. It's super dense, but it's just genius the way that they did it, because you can still hear everything that's going on if you want to. And, even when you don't listen to it for a while and you come back to it, you find something different in there that you never heard before, whether it's a instrument you never heard before, or like some effect you never heard before, or something that they did with the mixing that just made it so brilliant. It's very hard to do, but Radiohead, they're geniuses. So they pulled it off, I think, better than anyone. I can't think of too many other albums that are this dense. I don't know if there are any that are this dense and sound this good, but they did a great job. But anyway, Climbing Up the Walls is one of the least dense songs. There's sort of the least amount going on. It does build up towards the end, towards sort of the outro section, but it's sparser than most of the other songs. And I also think it's one of the most underrated songs on this album. Now, they do brilliant things in every single one of the songs. I could talk about all of them and brilliant things they did in all of them. But this one seems very underrated, and it's this small detail that really takes this song and puts it over the edge. But first of all, I'm not going to play too much of it because I don't want to get kicked off of YouTube, but here's the verse. It's really creepy. It's got a cool vibe to it. And if you sort of break down what's happening, if you listen to sort of the soundscape, the sound design, building from the drums back up to the top of the vocals, you got a very sparse drum kit happening. I think the only thing that's going on is a snare, with the snare turned off, so it sounds like a tom. So you don't have that rattle of the snare, that, and I think sleigh bells too. And that's it. Now it gets more complicated as the song goes on, but in the beginning it's just that, with a bass that's just outlining this E minor chord from B to G to E minor, or to E. So the E minor chord backwards from the fifth to the third to the root, which is actually interesting too key wise. I'll talk about that in a second, but. When the bass lands on that E, there's a filter on it, and he just opens it up. So that takes up a lot of space, takes up a lot of the harmonic quality of the verse, particularly the first verse. That, and then it's Tom York. And if you you don't necessarily notice it at first, but he's got a layered vocal here where I think he's doubling his main line, and it lands on that E. He's doubling that line, but then he also has an octave below. And so it makes this really thick vocal sound. And also the way that they mix it, it's very saturated. I don't think it's quite distorting yet, but that knob is turned up pretty high. And it's really right. Like it feels like it's really present in the mix. It's right in your face, and almost distorting. And with that double and the octave, and also it's sort of the way that it's EQ'd. It's almost slurred. There's not a lot of definition in his voices. It's a very haunting sound, but that also takes up space. So the things that are really taking up the majority of the mix, is particularly in the beginning, are his multiple voices and that bass. That's kind of the big thing. Now, I mentioned the key is interesting too, because the chords for the verse are very simple. It's just B minor to G major to E minor. And you spend a lot of time on that E minor, because the E minor is through a couple measures there. So you'd think normally when that happens, you're in that key. You'd think you'd be in E minor, but you're not. You're actually in B minor. And that's his vocal line. He's starting on that B, D, E, F sharp, E, D, E, D, B, E. So that's definitely B minor. But the keys are very similar. There's only one note difference between B minor and E minor, and that's the C sharp is in the B minor, and it's C natural in E minor. So that one note is the only real difference. So they're very closely related, and they sort of play in between. It kind of tricks your ear a little bit because you spend so much time on that E minor, and even the chorus is that same thing. It's the chorus is E minor to G. So you spend a lot of time on that E minor, so it tricks you a little bit. Which comes into play with the brilliant part in a minute. But anyway, very simple chordal structure. 3 chords in the verse, 2 chords in the chorus, and it stays really sparse until you get to the chorus here. Take a listen to this. You got this great guitar line. I think it's like the synth and guitar on the left-hand side going. And then this other guitar on the right-hand side doing this like a boo-doo-doo-doo type of thing. I love that descending line. It's so simple. It's just going right down the scale, starting on the octave all the way down the scale. But it's the B minor scale over this E minor. So it adds, it's a little bit weird because you're having the C sharp in there. It makes it pull a little bit strangely. It tricks your ear a little bit, but it makes it creepy. It's those odd notes in the key that make things unsettling. And they do it again in such a brilliant way. Which I'll get into. The last, and then the outro gets really big. I mean, with Tom York screaming and just more chirps and just denser chords, and there's some keys in there. One sounds almost like a foghorn. I can't tell, but I think it's a guitar in there. Wow, now. I think that's a guitar in there. It sounds like a foghorn to me. But anyway, so gets super big. But the brilliant thing is one note. So I talked about there's this pull between E minor and B minor, and the song's in B minor, but there's a lot of E minor happening. And what defines whether something is minor or major? It's the middle note in the chord. So if it's an E minor, the notes are E, G, and B. So with that middle note, G is what's defining whether it's major or minor. And if it's major, it's actually a half step higher. So it would be G sharp. That's what it starts. That's what it sounds like. Whereas E minor, that G sharp moves to a G, a half step down. So it's a very subtle difference between happy and sad, or comedy and tragedy. Now, if you're in E minor, pretty much the most dissonant thing you could possibly do is play with that E minor to E major thing. So Let's go back to the verse and let's see if we can identify something else that's going on here. Do you hear that chirp? It's on the right-hand side if you're in headphones, way up. It's this note. Hear that? That chirp? Now, I remember like the first few times I heard this album, and I remember hearing, and I listened to it straight. It's one of I think this happened more often in the 90s than it does now, but I listened to the album straight a few times. And I think it was sort of unique then, because a lot of times I would get turned on to an album by hearing something on the radio. So you'd be very familiar with a single, particularly if it hit like a top 40 or something. But I never heard any of it. The Radiohead wasn't that popular. I'm sure it was on some indie stations, but it's not like, your rock station was going to play one of the Radiohead songs from OK Computer. So there was no one song that drew me to the album. So I listened to it. Friends owned it. I didn't before I did, and just when I was hanging out with them, a few times I heard the album the entire way through. So I remember hearing this song and thinking it was creepy, but I didn't really dig into it until much later. And this wasn't the song that drew me to the album that really brought me in. Of course, the first two are amazing with Airbag and Paranoid Android. And then Karma Police I love that song going on, but it wasn't until later where I was sort of, if you consider this like a B-side, until I was getting through the B-sides that I really recognized what was going on here and why it was so creepy. And it is that note. That's a G sharp. And as I mentioned before, maybe the most dissonant thing you can do in a minor key is to play the major, and that's exactly what they did up there on the top. The song it's an E minor, so that means it's a G natural, but you're playing a G sharp up at the top. And it makes it so creepy. And it would be wrong. It would sound wrong. It's brilliant where they put it. Because if they played that note down where the chord is happening, it would sound like a mistake. Here, this is what it would sound like. Right? That sounds super bad. And that's because you're playing a G and a G sharp right at the same time. And those notes are right next to each other. That's super dissonant. But because it still sounds dissonant because I have a very small keyboard. But if I were to play it much higher, the further up it goes, the more away it goes from sort of that where the chord lives, the more creepy it sounds and the less wrong it sounds. But it's super creepy because that G sharp belongs nowhere near E minor. And it was such a brilliant move to do that, because you're using the happy note to make it sound creepy in a sad song. Just such a brilliant thing. And I don't know who came up with it, why they decided. It just seems like a simple yet very odd move to make, but you'd never think about doing that in a million years. But they did, and it really is the nuances in music, the surprises, the things that you don't expect that make music interesting. Otherwise, it's like reading a Dr. Seuss book. Good for kids. But, when you're more mature and you've read more mature things, you probably aren't going to go back and read it. Same thing with music. These little details, these little pieces of brilliance are what draw you back to it. And this song would have been a great song. If they didn't do it, still would have been pretty creepy. And the lyrics are super cool. And the rest of the vibe would have been amazing. But that G sharp just puts it right over the top.
Risks agent.